Hey everybody, welcome to the Fired Up with CJ show. Today we are going to learn about the Feldenkrais method, and we have an expert here, Steven Shafarman, who is going to be talking about his book Awareness Heals. So welcome, Steven.
Welcome, CJ. Delightful to be here.
Yeah, so tell me about what is Feldenkrais. A lot of people don't know what it is because I've told a couple people, I've done a couple sessions, I'm like, I'm doing Feldenkrais, like, what is that?
Yeah.
So tell.
Uh, when I first began, no one knew what it was, and now a lot of people have heard the name but know almost nothing about it except the name, or maybe they've heard that it's good stuff. Moshe Feldenkrais was an Israeli engineer, judo master, neuroscientist, and it's a method for helping people of all ages learn to breathe freely and move easily, to relieve or recover or eliminate back pain, arthritis, breathing problems. Uh, though one of the most exciting features of it is that it truly transcends any sense of a split between mind and body and spirit and really works with the whole person,
Hmm.
which fits nicely with the theme of your work and your shows from what I've seen.
Yeah. What do you mean by it? Unlike most things, it doesn't transcend mind, body, and spirit. What do you mean by
Uh,
that?
Well, we have the whole domain of physical activities and therapies,
Hmm.
chiropractic and rolfing and physical therapy and all the fitness programs. People do yoga and Pilates
Right.
and stretching and strength training.
Hmm.
And then there's the whole domain of mental, spiritual, meditation, mindfulness practices. And what Dr. Feldenkrais saw from the outset of developing the work is that there is no mental activity without a living, breathing human being.
Hmm.
And conversely, the way that we breathe and move expresses the way we sense and feel and think.
Hmm. When you look at patients, can you just look at someone and say, "Oh, I know you," just by watching their body movements and where they're holding their body, how they're breathing? Can you?
I have a lot of insight into people just
Yeah.
from many, many years of experience of looking at the way people breathe and move. Yeah.
Yeah.
Though I try not to let that get in the way of just really being present and empathic with my students.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I especially make sure that I'm not in any way judging, because from my perspective, fundamentally, everyone is doing the best that they know how at the moment.
Right.
In a
Right.
spiritual sense, everyone is perfect in the moment, yet we can all be more aware and more skillful. And
Mm.
that's what I'm doing with people, is helping you be more aware and more skillful, starting with the most immediate physical experience, aware of how you breathe, aware of how you sit, aware of what happens when you turn your head or take a step.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that, and I think awareness means so many different things, but at least when I was doing some of the exercises in your book, it would start off with, okay, be aware of where your weight is. If you're lying on the floor, where's your head relative to the floor? And I've noticed like my neck is generally not on the floor. I also notice that my right side of my body is generally heavier than the left side. But I've never thought about those things ever
Right? That's exactly the point. We
until
normally,
reading the book. Yeah.
yeah, uh, we generally take for granted the whole domain of our physical kinesthetic sensory experience.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because even one of the simple things is like, when you had to, I was doing some different seat. There was a section in here about bending, and you would arch your back, you'd be tipping your pelvis back and forth. And I never realized that the movement could be enhanced based on where my eyes are looking and where my head is facing. It's just an awareness that I didn't. So when you mean awareness, is it that just an awareness of what's efficient, or awareness? Because I also felt when I was taking these classes an awareness of, oh, I'm in yoga class and I'm actually realizing that when I press down on my feet and pull up from my head, I can actually do a warrior pose, where you're actually
Hmm.
doing a warrior pose when you're on one leg. and I could do it with a lot more, less pain and more efficiency. I could hold it longer because I was just imagining coming from my feet and tipping over and going all the way to my head. So is all of that under the rubric of awareness, or what do you mean by awareness?
All that is definitely awareness, and we can take it much farther than that.
Okay.
We are living beings. We are biological beings. We are sensory kinesthetic beings. We are also spiritual beings, of course. At every moment, we are continuously monitoring at the neurological level, below the level of consciousness. We're continuously monitoring what's happening in the environment all around us, with people nearby, all aspects, all of the joints and other tissues in the body. Conventionally, people talk about the five senses, but more fundamentally is the sixth sense, the kinesthetic and proprioceptive sense, the sense of your body and how you move. What Dr. Feldenkrais saw early on is that the way we move is not just about bones and muscles, but it's really a matter of the self-image. It's about how the body is represented within the nervous system. And all of us have gaps and blind spots in our awareness, whether generally or contextually. Okay. So I mentioned Dr. Feldenkrais was an engineer, neuroscientist, and judo master. In the 20s, he was living in Palestine, where he began learning martial arts and becoming involved with self-defense among the Israeli settlers. He then wrote a little book incorporating what he'd been discovering about self-defense and moved to Paris, where he became a principal assistant to Frédéric Joliot-Curie at the Sorbonne, and so spent his days in the top physics laboratory in the world. Was working with Joliot when Joliot won the Nobel Prize in physics. At the same time, Moshe was one of the founders of the Judo Club of Paris, working with a man who had been sent from Japan to introduce judo to the West. At the same time also, he was married to a pediatrician, so he was observing very young children in the way they move.
Right.
And another factor at the same time was he had severely damaged the ligaments and tendons in his knees during some soccer activities and accidents. And so he began to put all of these things together.
Right, integrating all together into Feldenkrais Method, which is what we see
and what became
today.
the Feldenkrais Method.
Right.
That's exactly right. And what he saw is that his judo master from Japan, a man named Kawaishi, moved like a healthy young child. As a physicist and engineer, he saw that Kawaishi and very young children move with a low center of gravity, all of the muscles working harmoniously, no strain or effort, breathing freely and easily all the time. And he realized that beyond early childhood, 3, 5, 7 years old, we all develop habits of straining, stiffening, holding our breath. And those habits become more entrained and pronounced over time. We become less aware of what we're doing physically.
Right.
And in our modern world, even more so than 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And we're so focused. We've got computers and cell phones and all these immense distractions. Yeah. People are sitting and they're texting and for hours at a time, holding their breath, slouched, relatively immobile.
Right.
Well, our conscious mind is focused on the content of the text message and what's happening on the screen.
Right.
But your brain is constantly coordinating the activity everywhere.
Yeah.
And so, in effect, we are constantly reinforcing habits of straining and holding our breath.
Okay, so if I were to replicate the typical movement, I mean, look at this, right? Because this is what we do. I mean, oftentimes, because now there's no free time. We're always checking email or text. This is what it looks like, right?
Yeah.
Right. So what am I doing? My shoulders are slumped over. My head is. Yeah.
Yes, you're barely breathing.
I'm not, because it's all in here.
Yeah, and this is exactly the point. When we begin to think organically and look at the whole person, it's very clear that when we're not moving skillfully, we are in effect strengthening the habits of holding our breath. And tight muscles become tighter and compressed joints become more compressed. Mm-hmm. And over years and decades, that's really the source of chronic back pain and arthritis and stenosis and degenerative hip and knee conditions and the whole range of emotional and psychological and spiritual difficulties.
Okay, what's your prediction of what's going to happen when I do this? You know, because this is the other thing that we're doing, right? So we're tilting probably on our predominant hand, right? We're tilting our head. I'm using a remote, but it could be easily a phone. I'm tilting my head. I'm listening. My whole body is kind of like, arced like in a little C like this.
Yeah.
And I'm probably, what I do because I've done yoga is I keep on going like this and I switch back and forth so I'm not leaning all the time. And
that's a good start, but it's only the start.
Okay, so what's your prediction of what's going to happen to us? Probably like when I'm 50, when people in their 20s turn 90, and they've been doing this and doing this, what is it going to translate to? What's your prediction?
Well, there are going to be a lot of very wealthy orthopedic surgeons. and the recent statistics I've seen, close to 500,000 spinal fusions are performed every year at a cost of...
What's a spinal fusion?
That's when the surgeons go in and fuse two discs, two of the vertebrae, because of dysfunction in the back.
Right, because I'm going like this the whole time, right? So what happens over time is there's not enough space in between the vertebrae, and then then I just lose all. What happens? Do I lose capability, or what happens?
We lose capability. Every cell in the body is constantly making sense of its immediate environment. So the places where we're not moving, the intelligent cells and tissues begin to respond and say, oh, I guess we don't need to move. Let's just build up more calcium in those joints, because if we're not going to move, then it's easier to not move if we calcify the joints.
Right. Clearly, this person wants to stabilize being in this position all the time, so let's do it by creating a calcification of her spine.
That's
so
exactly
that she
right.
can do it more efficiently, right? I mean, I'm
That's
trying to help
exactly
you out.
Right.
Okay. So is this related to the self-image? So like the little
That's
parts
exactly
of
right.
my,
Yes.
like, my spine used to be like, I'm a fluid, open, mobile thing. Now I'm like this, like, I don't know, like a T-Rex, my phone all day. So I'm kind of fusing. It's saying, oh, well, your self-image is that I guess you don't need that stuff, so I'll start changing your body, right?
That's exactly what happens.
Okay.
And the exciting thing is that it's reversible at any age.
That's what I find so miraculous. So my first Feldenkrais awareness through movement class was among a bunch of 85 and 90-year-olds. I was like, I'm actually young here, which I liked immensely, but I was in there, and the interesting thing is I was having the same pains and aches that an 80-year-old would have. I mean, I was like, oh, my hip hurts, and they're like, yeah, me too. Thinking, oh, okay, I can see that if I don't address this, I may not even be able to move my hip, but you can, right? At any point.
At any age, you can learn to be more flexible, more lithe and supple, more youthful. And I have a student who, at the age of 98, I've been working with her quite regularly. She used to refer to me as her trainer. And At the age of 98, she could walk a mile while swinging her arms, holding 1-pound weights in each hand.
Wow. Now that's what I want. I want to actually have vitality, right? Because
Absolutely.
sadly, my uncle that just passed was in a wheelchair and he couldn't do any. I mean, he was just like mobilized in this particular way the whole time. Even he could have done Feldenkrais and gotten some liberty in his movement, right? I mean, you don't have
Absolutely.
to be
Yes.
able to walk, stand, lie down on the ground.
The last time Dr. Feldenkrais taught in the U.S. was the summer of 1981. And I traveled with him that summer as his assistant and appointment secretary. And he was working with people. Actually, the very last large public workshop he taught was, in fact, here in Washington, D.C. And his title for it was For Gold Medalists and Their Grandparents. And there were
That's fantastic.
about 400 people in the hall. Some of them obviously fit, very active, athletic, wearing their running shoes. Some of them had probably been out jogging that morning.
Right.
Others who came in wheelchairs and with crutches and very obviously had serious physical difficulties.
Right.
But we are all human beings.
Right.
And during that summer, he was working with a lot of children who had been diagnosed with cerebral palsy or Down syndrome or other neurological conditions, and also a lot of seniors who'd had strokes or people who'd had multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's disease. And again, we are all human beings. We are all capable of becoming more aware and skillful, beginning here and now as you are.
Now, when I did watch the Feldenkrais Guild video, and they were saying, for athletes, someone was saying, well, I did Feldenkrais and I shaved 1 minute off of my mile run because I don't know if it was breathing more efficiently or moving more efficiently or both. So is that, and then there was this great article that you have about Dr. J coming in and trying to, were you there? I don't know if you were there or you heard the story.
Yes,
when Dr.
I was there.
Okay, so I would love to hear the story. So what happened when because you said that when you were watching him play basketball, it was just this beautiful, elegant movement, an example of how to move fluidly and perfectly efficiently. But then why was he there? What was happening outside of the court?
It was toward the end of his career. This was in 1981. And for your listeners and viewers who don't know, Dr. J was the #1 basketball player during those years, through the 70s and into the early 80s, on a par with Michael Jordan and LeBron James. We all tend to compartmentalize. So he knew how to move beautifully on the basketball court. His head was completely mobile, always looking around, aware of where all the other players were, the baskets, the ball. But in every day, watching him walk when he came in for the lesson, he had a noticeable limp. He was somewhat hunched over. He'd had various injuries during his career. Similarly, I see a lot of people who do yoga and they move beautifully in the yoga studio, but they have poor posture, stiffness, or chronic pain the rest of the time.
Yep. So it's a compartmentalization where you have great habits in that context of playing basketball or being in the yoga class, but then you're getting out of your car, you're sitting at your desk,
that's
eating
exactly
dinner,
right.
You're kind of like, like in yoga, I'm like, whoa, but then I'll be eating dinner and I'm like,
Yeah. And I always start with, think about healthy young children. At 2 years old, 3 years old, 5 years old, kids naturally move beautifully, breathing freely, aligning with gravity. I watch parents with their young children in strollers, and in a firm stroller where the kid can really sit up, most children prefer to sit without any back support. And they're sitting up and they're looking around.
I've seen it, but I don't know if it's the strollers, but I feel like I've seen a lot of babies like this now. Is that because the adults put them in that place?
That's because the adults put them in that place.
That's
in
sad.
a wiser culture, and even in Western culture, 20 or 30 years ago, kids probably spent a lot more time just sitting on the floor and moving around spontaneously. And
now they're like this.
Now starting
with their iPads.
Very early on.
That's actually, it's not even funny. That's actually sad. Because
yes,
I know, because I was actually just did a walk around the lake and I saw the kids and they were kind of like slumped over like this, or they're laying flat on the ground with their feet out, or they have some iPad that's like glued to their hands. You know, we will all be T-Rex at one point walking around. So the thing that you mentioned in the book that I thought was so spot on was, you think about a baby who was just like, babies have the most enormous heads, you know, and they have, and then, like, their head weighs so much relative to their body strength. And how are they, like, and I didn't even think about this, but how do babies manage a gigantic bowling ball of a head where they have, like, you know, they have no muscles? They're just, I mean, we feel babies and you touch them and they're no muscles. They're just a bunch of gushy fatness. How are they even able to hold that head up or even move?
Well, and that's the real skill of healthy young children and some adults when we're performing at our best, is that all of the muscles have relatively equal tone and there's no excess effort. Mm-hmm. And so holding the head up is using all the muscles at the pelvis and right down to the feet. And it's not just the neck.
Right.
And this is the problem with a lot of our modern ideas about exercise and fitness. Whenever we focus on individual muscles or parts of the body, typically we disturb the integrity of the system and actually create imbalances.
Yes.
The example I often use is push-ups.
Yes. Okay.
And people think push-ups, oh, great for my arms and shoulders, right?
Yeah.
But your brain is smarter than that. And your brain, while doing push-ups, is saying, oh, I guess we need to be strengthening these arm and shoulder muscles while also strengthening the rigidity in the trunk, the rigidity at the hip joints. And so...
And stability in your... You're right, because you're doing this... Yeah, you're saying stability and rigidity in your hips, so that...
Yeah, and that's
the problem. It's not just an arm thing, it's a whole body thing.
It's never just the arm thing.
Right.
And real strength requires flexibility. Mm-hmm. And basic anatomy says that every movement involves some muscles contracting while opposite muscles lengthen. Mm-hmm. While doing a push-up, all the muscles in the trunk, right, the ribs and pelvis and hip joints, are completely rigid.
Right.
And so when those muscles are rigid, they are in effect compressing the tissues in the joints, squeezing blood vessels, squeezing nerves.
Right.
And that rigidity, obviously, is the opposite of spontaneity and flexibility and ease and fluidity.
I see. You would hate bar classes. Have you ever seen a bar class?
Yes, I've watched lots of different kinds of classes. And
oh my gosh! I've never been so insanely bored and mesmerized and confused. And when I was in a bar class, I'm like, how many times are you people going to do squats? Like,
well, and that's the way that I look at exercise is, would a healthy 3-year-old do that?
No, it was insane. I was doing like 100 squats. And I thought, what is the purpose? Like, first of all, why do I need to have quads and glutes that are this strong? Because I'm never going to be doing 100 squats in my life. I just don't understand the bar class.
Quads and glutes are overworking, mm-hmm, then many other muscles are underworking.
Yes.
And this is especially clear if we think about any sort of chronic back pain, mm-hmm, a low back pain of any sort, however it's described or experienced or diagnosed, or degenerative conditions in the hips or knees. Well, if you touch your ribs, and I present this at flexaware.com, my website, flexaware.com, mm-hmm, if you touch your ribs, you'll feel that they move.
Right.
And we normally don't think about it.
Mine don't move, but okay. Oh, you mean like
they
when
do.
I'm moving back and forth, they move?
No,
yes.
Just when you're breathing.
Yes,
so
okay,
you notice that as you breathe, your ribs are moving a bit downward and inward with the exhale, mm-hmm, and they're moving a bit upward and outward with the inhale.
Right.
And you can touch in your upper chest, around the collarbones, under the armpits. And if you breathe a bit more slowly and more deeply, you'll detect that even the first rib and the second rib move a bit as you breathe.
Mm-hmm.
And movement in front clearly means there must be movement in the back where the ribs meet the spine.
Mm-hmm.
So what we want to do is increase the mobility of the ribs, the mobility of the joints where the ribs meet the spine, the coordination of all of those muscles around the trunk, because breathing is not just the diaphragm moving up and down or the belly moving forward and back. Breathing is really the changing of the volume throughout the trunk, movement in the back and sides, and that's obvious if we look at young children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really
When
obvious.
look at a
babies sleeping.
baby, or you hold a young child.
Yeah.
It's really just like a balloon or a sponge, and the movement is three-dimensional, and everything is soft and fluid.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, young children at a year, 2, 3, are remarkably flexible and remarkably strong. Mm-hmm. They have immense stamina and resilience.
Yeah, even though they don't, I mean, they're, like you said, they're uniformly about, the same muscular strength, but yet they can do things that seem unbelievable if you think about like a gigantic, probably 7-pound head on this little body that weighs like 10 pounds at most, 15 pounds.
That strength and flexibility isn't a result of doing yoga or Pilates or stretch classes or bar or anything else. Yeah. It's moving efficiently.
Yeah, and
that strength and flexibility.
Yeah.
The bones are still soft, especially at the ends. The bones are still soft. So bones are not like hinges or levers.
Right.
In fact, what we now know from MRIs and X-rays is there's actually a gap within all of the joints. There's a gap of 1 to 3 millimeters so that the bones can move freely. They don't touch. And what this tells us is that all of the conventional ideas in the anatomy textbooks and the medical texts are flawed. It's an old paradigm that is just really proving to be invalid with the new science. And so with the Feldenkrais method and with the flex-aware exercises and with some of this other new science, we're really learning to see the body as a dynamic, integrated system. So if you just do a simple movement of twiddling your finger, we're not aware of it, but that movement involves all the muscles in your arm and right back to the shoulder and even down to your pelvis.
Wow, the pelvis is surprising to me, but I think I could probably feel if I focused on it and was. And
what I encourage our viewers to do is if you just do this so that there's a bit of resistance. So that
you're taking, for people who are listening on the radio, you're taking your pointer finger and you're pointing it towards your face.
Yeah, so just flexing your finger. And if you do that so that you're pulling on something, so the back of a chair, or I have...
Right. I'm pulling on something like this, yeah.
But no, something firm, like...
Okay.
So here's a kettlebell. That's, so if I'm pulling on this, and I do that 10 or 15 times, I'll clearly begin to detect. And if
I can feel it all the way from my shoulder down to my spine. I can't feel it all the way.
If you were standing, you would feel it down to your feet.
Yes, I
believe
that's
it's instantaneous.
True. Yeah.
It's not simply the nerves transmitting a message. Instantaneously, all of the tissues reconfigure and reorganize.
Yeah. Okay, so what's interesting is on my first Feldenkrais class, I started feeling my feet, and I felt how my feet were connected to my head, and I could feel how my torso was involved in turning, and if in fact I came from my feet and turned to the left or turned to the right, I had way more range of motion when I involved my torso than when I just this is how CJ usually turns her head before.
Yeah.
And
this is...
Right, and it hurts.
We tend to think of the body as a collection of separate parts.
Yeah.
Tend to think of turning the head or turning the neck.
Yeah.
And we don't realize that turning involves all of the muscles, and
Right.
if we're aware of the pelvis and hip joints and the movement within the trunk, then the muscles work more efficiently and we turn farther with less effort.
Yeah, and the thing that was so interesting though when I did it is this whole midsection I couldn't feel anything. I could feel the
Well,
impulses from my feet all the way up to my head, and then this is like, barren nothingness.
yeah. And that again is comes from long-term habits of holding our breath.
Mm,
Because whenever we're holding our breath, the ribs and the middle and upper back are relatively rigid. It's
yeah.
like inflating a balloon and tying a knot in it.
Interesting.
When we breathe freely, then that structure is completely mobile. Then each rib can move a bit relative to the next. Then each rib can move relative to the two vertebrae that it meets. And that mobility allows all of the muscles to work more efficiently so that the strength in the pelvis and hip joints is transmitted through to the turning of your head and the movement of
Right.
your eyes and shoulders and hands.
Right. Well, so
Another
this
example,
myself
your self-image.
image was not
Again,
in here because it was kind of it was equivalent of this. It's
yes,
frozen in a static position because I'm not breathing
yes,
fully, so I'm not moving. Therefore, it's like I can't feel the chain of reaction because there probably isn't a chain reaction,
yeah,
right?
that's exactly. We have learned as young children, we naturally move spontaneously, efficiently,
Yes.
harmoniously. And then over time, we develop habits of straining and stiffening. We, in effect, learn to be less aware. We learn to be more rigid. And that learning, as you've said very clearly, is much more severe today because we're spending so much time
Right.
sitting in fixed positions, looking at screens and looking at
Right.
keyboards. I Dr. Feldenkrais last taught in the U.S. was the summer of 1981 when I was traveling with him.
Mm-hmm.
And the world has changed enormously since then.
Mm-hmm.
And if we normally don't think about it. We just take the current situation for granted.
Mm-hmm.
But in the 60s and 70s and through most of the 80s, people didn't exercise the way we do today.
Oh yeah.
Treadmills and stationary bikes and Nautilus machines and Cybex and all this other kind of equipment. Most of it hadn't even been invented yet.
Right.
People also moved more actively in our everyday activities.
Right.
The 60s and 70s and through most of the 80s, if you had any kind of desk job as an accountant or lawyer or secretary or student, you would reach for the telephone. You
Right.
would change the paper in the typewriter.
Yeah, you'd be like using your the type, the
and
keypads or whatever.
doing anything, even using a typewriter
Right.
instead of a keyboard, using the return or changing
Yeah.
the paper.
Yeah.
All of that movement involves your pelvis and your hip joints, and shifting your weight involves your
Oh.
breathing. Now, in our work activities in front of the computer and in our exercise activities, we're much more compartmentalized. People are at the gym using stationary bikes and treadmills while listening to a recorded book or watching television. And so the mental and the physical are much
Disconnected.
more dissociated. And of course, if the mental and the physical are dissociated, then the emotional and the spiritual are seriously impaired.
Mm-hmm.
Every experience of stress, anxiety, fear, depression involves some disturbance in breathing, some change in the muscles in the neck and shoulders and chest.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
When we breathe freely and move easily, then we can spontaneously recover from stress, fear, anxiety, depression. And I live in Washington. I have a number of students who are in the military or retired military who've been diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress. And I had one student who'd been shot several times, and when he first started with me, he'd had lots of other therapies, but no one had talked with him about breathing and how the first thing we do when we experience stress is we tighten the chest and hold our breath. And when I began to help him learn to exhale and move more actively and to be aware specifically of the ribs here and how the ribs move with exhaling. I'm in DuPont Circle, which is a crowded neighborhood, and one day after doing a lesson with me, he and his wife went to, there was a big public around Halloween time. There's a big event. It's called the drag race, high heel drag race. And so drag queens in high heels and all their get up run a few blocks down 17th Street, a few blocks from where I live.
Yeah.
And it's very crowded and noisy and popular. And he and his wife went to this event. And the next time I saw him, he told me about it and said that a few weeks earlier, he would not have been able to be in a crowd like that without having a panic attack.
But just breathing and being conscious.
Knowing how to breathe freely, and this is one of the key insights with FlexAware and the Feldenkrais Method and studying young children, is that when we clearly experience a more comfortable and effective way of being, that new experience will naturally tend to replace the old habit. So the old habit of a panic attack, of fear, of straining and stiffening, tensing the shoulders, we can leave it behind. And this is the way I like to talk about healing. If we really look at the way young children learn to crawl and walk and run and skip, well, as young children learn to walk and run and skip, they outgrow crawling. And my idea is that at any age, you can become more aware and skillful to outgrow arthritis or outgrow back pain or outgrow PTSD or outgrow anxiety disorders. And as I mentioned, I had a student who I worked with her for several years until she was almost 99.
Wow, I love that. She's
up
swinging
until
weights.
Yeah.
I think that's fantastic. Okay, I have a couple questions on some people who are now they're like, I want to try this, and there's lots of different options. There's an ATM, awareness through movement class, which is a group class, and functional integration, where you have a one-on-one appointment with someone who is kind of probably more hands-on, showing you something. Tell us a little bit about what are the pros and cons of each. Can you get as much in one as the other, or what do you get in one versus the other?
They're really two different ways of communicating this same message.
Okay.
Dr. Feldenkrais, as I mentioned, spent the 30s in Paris doing judo and physics and engineering. In the 40s, he escaped to England after Paris fell to the Nazis, and spent the 40s living in England, where he was doing weapons research for the British Admiralty. And that was when he actively began developing what became the Feldenkrais Method. And partly he wanted to begin teaching judo, but as he would tell the story, quote, those stiff British bodies would break. So he found that he needed to simplify the judo instruction about rolling and falling and throwing and such, and began to make things much more simple and explicit, and developed that into the verbal process that became awareness through movement.
Which is the group class that you do.
Which is the group class.
You know, saying like, okay, notice what's happening
when
you're lifting your leg or you're moving. That's
right. As you lift your hand, notice that there's some movement also in your shoulder or down to your pelvis.
Right.
As you flex, feel that it becomes easier if you also allow your pelvis to tilt.
Right. So that's one method, and then the functional.
Yes, and then during that period, he also found that he could work with individuals, and that instead of or in addition to the verbal instructions, one-on-one, he could just put his hands on someone and gently guide the preferred movement possibility. And he came to call that functional integration. But the two methods are really just parallel ways of communicating this underlying message about being more aware and more skillful. And with both approaches, the emphasis is on eliminating any excess effort, completing more of the self-image, filling in the gaps in our own image. And so both methods are extremely gentle and relatively slow and subtle, and many people find it overly slow and subtle because it really compels you to be attentive to what's happening in the moment.
Okay, so my girlfriend explained it as such, and I don't really know because I've done 3 functional integration classes, sessions, one in which it was very hands-on, like having to move my head like this, and I was like, why am I paying someone to do this? So we're just moving back and forth and like moving my shoulders. It was like these little micro movements. But it was, my girlfriend explained it as like, I don't want to have to think about it. I just want my body to know what it needs to do. I don't want to have someone explain to me philosophically, educationally, and anatomically what's happening. Just move me and my body will be like, oh, I get it. And now I can move that way. And I was in the ATM class and I liked it because I'm like, oh, I like to think about it. And then I'm like, so is that really what the difference is? Or is that just because I haven't done enough of these classes to know?
And that's one way to think of the differences. And some of us really like the awareness through movement group classes and the thinking process. And some of us really like just the more hands-on and less thinking about it and just experiencing it.
You can do this. Okay.
Yeah. And a lot of what I'm doing now I call flex aware, which takes these ideas and makes them more dynamic and more explicit. So it's really an alternative to yoga or stretching or strength training that extends and enhances the benefits of Feldenkrais lessons.
Okay, so here's some more.
And so it's sort of a continuum of learning possibilities and options.
Okay, here's what I did. I don't know if you'll find this funny or alarming. Or a little bit of both. So I started doing Feldenkrais, and I've been trying to figure out the practitioner that my body is happiest with for functional integration. I have an ATM class, but I figured my body will decide. So I tried 3 different practitioners, and then one cautioned me not to do too much, and I was like, "What? I'm hardly doing anything." Okay, so in your book, you actually have you take the most common types of movements that we make: turning and twisting, leaning, breathing, sitting, and so there's one on bending and breathing, and it comes in like 10 steps, 4 parts. So there's probably 40 different movements that you do, and so I did them all. And then I thought, well, I'm not sure. Well, my real issue is sitting, so I did the other 40 in sitting. And then I did the other 40.
That's great.
And then I
love
did
hearing
the 40 in walking. And I found the whole thing just fascinating. But then what I found, my body started breaking out in hives. Something happened with my
interesting.
I do chiropractic work. And I've noticed that when I shake around my central nervous system, I break out in hives. And I thought, and then I went to a class of which I've done forever. And there are these foot movements that we do in and out as like footwork to, get your body warmed up. And I couldn't do the footwork anymore. I just can't remember how to do the footwork. And then I went up the steps and I tripped and fell on my knee. And I thought, oh my gosh, I think I've hit that point. That's too much. So what's happening with the central nerve? I was shocked because, I'm kind of like, I'm moving like this, like, they're like these little micro movements. I'm like, what? It's nothing. So I just kept on pounding through them. And then my body got so confused. I think I'm attributing it to Feldenkrais because I can't figure out what else happened when I did it.
You may have done more than you were really prepared for. And the emphasis on do less and go slower is really based on neuroscience.
Okay.
There's a basic fact discovered in the mid-1800s is that our ability to detect differences is inversely correlated with the intensity of the stimulus.
Okay.
So when we're doing repeated hard work, we don't detect subtle strain or stiffness or soreness.
Right.
When we begin to slow it down and do less, We can discover the habitual strain and tension. And you probably learned those familiar movements from that class long ago, and you've been doing them just by rote without much thinking. You may have learned them under a stressful situation because you wanted to impress the other students or the teacher. This is what I see a lot with people doing yoga and Pilates and such, is that we want to impress the cute guy or girl who's teaching the class or on the mat next to us.
Look how flexible I am.
Yes.
Yeah. So
the
that
wisdom that
changed, shifted something.
Yeah.
And
shifted
inside,
something
like
and
what?
left you a little bit disoriented and in an unfamiliar place. But it's when we're a little bit disoriented and doing things that are unfamiliar that we're really able to learn and experience something new.
Ah, okay.
And this is the wisdom of very young children. At 6 months, a year, 2 years, kids don't worry about looking good or impressing anyone.
Right.
It's just about what feels right in the moment.
Right.
And this is why so many people hurt themselves when they're at the gym and using the treadmill or even in yoga or Pilates, because we're doing things by rote. We're not sufficiently attentive. With breathing, for example, everyone talks about breathing. But we just made the idea of breathing more concrete and explicit about the fact that when you're breathing, your ribs are moving. Well, almost everyone focuses on breathing as if it's only the diaphragm or only the belly, and they ignore the movement of the ribs. Well, if you ignore something, it becomes less efficient. So
right, and so even all of a sudden saying, hey, I recognize that you're there, has a huge change on the central nervous system. And is that because your nervous system is going like, wait a second, I didn't even know you're here. Like all of a sudden someone enters into the party like, who's that? Oh, it's my neck. Or like, oh, you're breathing. What? I didn't even know I had ribs. Is that why it's so shocking to the system?
Yes, indeed. It's discovering something that's been inhibited for years or decades.
Okay, got it. No. So I think I discovered pretty quickly what was too much because I was falling and not remembering things. My personal trainer said, what happened? And I was like, do you know when you get into a rental car and you're like, I don't know how to drive this rental car, even though you've driven for, a bajillion years? That's what I felt like in my body all of a sudden, like, what is this? What is this body? Okay, so...
And for me, getting back to the theme of your show and what we were talking about right at the beginning, for me, what is most exciting about all of this is seeing how what we're doing in learning to be more aware and skillful physically is also providing immense benefits psychologically and emotionally and spiritually, because we are whole integrated beings all the time.
I was elated when I walked out of my functional integration class where we did the clock thing with your pelvis and you're from 12 to 6, So I did that and I thought, oh my gosh, I have hips. I was so excited. And I was walking and there was a certain amount of fluidity and movement that I don't remember ever feeling. And I was just so elated at that moment to be able to walk. So I think that's what you mean by that.
What I tell all of my students is to be aware of that moment.
Yeah, it was there. And I was thrilled.
Sense and think about that moment with as much detail as you can.
Yeah.
Because normally we just take the body for granted and we live pain or nothing in terms of our physical capacities.
Right. Versus like I opened up a little potentiality in my self-image using your parlance.
Exactly.
And it was like, wait a second, I didn't even know I was here. Yay, let's all come to the party. It's just going along.
And you can continue to enhance that and extend it in terms of the range and movement in your hip joints and how your balance is affected. And you can take that into your personal training activities or yoga classes or walking or running or dancing or...
Everything is better Taking a shower,
That's
sitting
exactly
in the
right.
car, eating at dinner, it's because it all translates. Okay, we have 1 more minute, so I want to ask you a quick question. So, how long until a habit changes? Because, in coaching, they always say it takes 3 months. And then you said in your book, you said sometimes it can be one session and you're.
Absolutely.
So, how long should I invest in Feldenkrais? Is it a
When you
lifetime activity?
clearly experience the new possibility,
Oh, okay.
the new possibility can replace the old habit instantaneously.
Interesting. So even doing it
What's
once.
what's important is the clarity of your experience and the quality of your awareness.
Okay.
See, and in coaching and a lot of conventional therapeutic models, it's about conscious control. And what Dr. Feldenkrais realized is that we don't operate through conscious control. And we operate spontaneously, and consciousness comes later.
I
And I
see.
was studying philosophy and psychology when I met Moshe, and I saw that his way of working with movement and the body was the most exciting path for me to pursue philosophy and psychology. And I now think of myself as a hands-on philosopher,
Hmm.
using movement and touch to guide people to think more effectively and to
Hmm.
sense and feel more accurately.
Yeah, I think of it as
And
very Taoist because it's about
yes,
small. It's not about gigantic swooping gestures. It's about small, subtle changes, and that it doesn't have to be hard. Life can be easy. In fact, it should be easy, right?
yes, and with awareness and a sense of ease, we can do big dramatic things.
Mm-hmm.
We can apply these insights into ease and awareness and skill to being much more effective as athletes or dancers.
Mm-hmm.
Or we can apply these ways of thinking to transforming the political system
Right.
or being more skillful within our families and in our relationships.
Right.
Or so if we start with the small and subtle, the big and grand is also transformed,
I
and
know.
that is
So it's
very
so
Taoist.
different. It's so different than the way we think. It's so different. All right, we actually have Steven Shafarman here, and we've been talking about his book, Awareness Heals. Thank you so much. That was great fun.
Yes, this was great fun. Thank you, CJ.
Okay.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. I would love your support in any way by giving me comments below or to subscribe to the show or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.